and welcome back to another edition of the Physiotutors podcast. I'm your host, Sunny Sandhu, and today on the show we have Bart Dingenen. For anyone who's unfamiliar with Bart, he is a physiotherapist, a researcher, and a lecturer from Belgium, specialising in sports rehabilitation and prevention. More specifically, our topic of today, ACL rehab. So, without further delay, Bart, why don't you give us a quick hello and a little overview of your background?
Hello, good morning, everyone, and thank you, Sunny, for the invitation as well to be your guest today for this podcast. So basically, I've been practicing now for around 10 years as a physio, mainly focusing on lower extremity sports-related injuries. That's my background a little bit. So when I graduated in like 10 years ago, actually, as a physical therapist, I immediately started working in a private practice before I started my PhD at KU Leuven, the biggest university in Belgium. I did my PhD there, so it's the same university where I also graduated. And I had there a very interesting position. I was working there as an assistant. It means that I combined my research activities, my PhD work, with also teaching and also clinical practice. So this is a position which was available there, and I'm very grateful that I had the opportunity to work there on the supervision of Professor Staes, who was my promoter there during my PhD. Mm-hmm. Where I could then combine these different kind of activities. So that was very good experience for me. And also, again, I was very thankful that I had the opportunity to combine these different aspects. So I think it's really helpful to develop yourself as a person, as a researcher, but also as a physio, that you have different inputs from different fields as well, and you can develop yourself in a better way. So at the same time, I feel a little bit, when I see now the evolution these days, I see that these positions are not so much available anymore. So you have, mostly at universities, you have now positions which are mainly focused or on clinical practice or mainly on research. So the combination is often difficult to get, even though I think it's absolutely an added value if you can combine these different things. So for me, it's the added value, and it has been a good experience to combine these things. So then moving along, so in 2015, I finished my PhD, which was focused on postural control measurements in relation to ACL injuries, but also chronic ankle instability. But maybe we can discuss that later in the podcast. But after that PhD, then I worked 1 year as a postdoc at the same university, KU Leuven, also again combining research and clinical practice there. After that year, I went to another university in Belgium, University of Hasselt, where I'm still working now. Mm-hmm. And that's still a part-time position at university, which I combine with clinical work in a private clinical practice here in the neighborhood in Genk. And there I see mainly patients with lower extremity sports-related injuries, a lot of ACLs, but also a lot of more, let's say, the overuse injuries, like running injuries, etc. This is my main population currently. Yeah.
Okay. So what was it that got you more interested into the sports side of physiotherapy? Was it that initial dive into private practice, or was there something else?
It's a good question, but I think everything starts with curiosity. It's just starting from my very deep interest in this topic, and just based on curiosity that I developed, I think during or maybe even before I already started with my studies of physiotherapy, I was already very much interested in this kind of sports injury, etc. So when I started my studies, I also got into contact with research during the master years with my supervisor as well, Professor Staes. And that was another aspect. It wasn't groin injuries in athletes, but it was also something. When I was working on that, I got just more and more interested and fascinated by the field of sports medicine, and often doing that master thesis there, I had then the opportunity to work on the PhD. So I can say, the curiosity and the interest and fascination for these aspects came already a long time ago. I think even before my studies. And it's also something when I see students, for example, at the university, some of them, they only decide one day before the academic year to do physical therapy, for example, this difficult decision making just before the academic year.
Yeah.
But in my case, I knew already a lot of years before that I want to be a physical therapist, and it has always been my drive and my passion for that to become a very good physical therapist, and to become better and better every day. The most critical person I see is probably myself. So I always want to be better, to learn from my mistakes, and to become a better physio every day. And I think that's a little bit my reason to go into sports medicine. And after working in the field, both in research and in clinical practice, I think I'm still very happy with the choice I made to go in this field as a sports physical therapist. I really like working with athletes or just people who want to move or want to achieve some goals, achieve a better quality of life, and just to help people doing things they love in life. And that's what I like to do, creating a change for people.
Sorry, can you say that last bit again? Creating a change?
Yeah, change in their, if they have a certain goal or in their life, for example, doing a sport activity again, or coming back after injury, or sometimes it's also a little bit about mindset. So some people think they can never run again. They think they can never go up the stairs or whatever. They think they cannot do anymore. But sometimes that's what I mean with creating a change, for people to get out of this vicious circle and to get into a better quality of life and a better functional level.
Fantastic. So obviously you've mentioned that going more towards sports people and sort of helping their quality of life and whatnot. You mentioned sort of runners are more typically your population. What got you more interested in that side of things and more towards the knees and sort of ACL rehab?
Yeah. So yeah, maybe that needs also a little bit background. So first, as I just mentioned, I started my PhD then first.
Yeah.
And the project was actually a follow-up project of a previous PhD, which was mainly focused on chronic ankle instability.
Mm-hmm.
So posture control measurements there, muscle activation patterns, and stability outcomes. So when I started the PhD, it was mainly also focused on a follow-up of that previous project, continuing the research on chronic ankle instability.
Okay.
But again, I was fortunate enough to work with a supervisor who was very open-minded, and he allowed me also to have my own inputs in the research projects. And then I think it's a little bit based on the developments during the years, the patients that I saw in clinical practice, but also the topic which was then mainly first on chronic ankle instability, which made us wonder, okay, maybe based on the theoretical background, we have a ligamentous injury. It would be very interesting to check whether similar findings could be observed in another population, ACL patients, where we know it's more for a sensory motor background, that we could have similar alterations in terms of muscle activation, in terms of posture control, bilateral finding, etc., where we worked on. And that's the reason why we first went then also to do research in ACL patients. So that was the first step, that we measured mainly ACL injured and mainly ACL reconstructed patients.
Okay.
Then in the next steps, I was again getting back to my supervisor, and I said, okay, now we have data on the injured patients, but it will be very interesting to know also what the non-injured patients who might get an injury, how they would perform doing similar tasks. So then I set up quite a big prospective study where we measured athletes from handball, football, volleyball athletes from different sports, female athletes, who might be at risk to get an ACL injury. And we measured them before the start of the season, and we did them these post-control measurements, muscle activation patterns, but also dynamic tests such as drop vertical jumps, single leg, double leg, single leg squats, etc. So within that project, and also based on this perspective on injury and injury risk, we developed also a broad interest in different screening tests, etc. And then we came also into the non-acute injuries such as patellofemoral pain, etc. So I think it's really, again, it starts from curiosity, and it's based on my own input within the research field and a research project that I had, that I could make my own research lines, which are currently still focusing on ACL.
Yeah.
And then also a side project which came also bigger and bigger now is on running injuries, but that's not the topic of today, but that's what I'm currently working on. Yeah.
Okay. Wow. Amazing. So there is a lot to unpack there. Literally, you go right through the lower limb from the hip down to ankle.
Actually, I started in the hip. I went to the ankle, and I went then to the knee, and now if you look at running injuries, we do everything, So it's always lower extremity. And the thing is, maybe also my bias there is that when I was at university, I was always teaching also on lower extremity.
Okay.
So, by doing and getting more into depth on these topics, you get more and more interested.
Yeah.
And you also get to know that we don't know so many things yet.
Absolutely.
You want to develop your own field of interest, and you want to go more into depth there. That's a little bit maybe the reason why these things developed that way.
Yeah, I can imagine so. But yeah, as you mentioned, the topic of today is the ACL rehab. So obviously you mentioned a lot there, going through the whole lower extremity, but can you give us a little bit more about the anatomy of the knee? Just for anybody listening who may not be too familiar or just needs a quick refresher course.
Yeah, sure. So if we talk now just about the ACL, then it's really a key structure in the knee joint. So I think even in sports medicine, it's one of the most frequently studied structures in the musculoskeletal system. Look at the number of publications; it's really amazing, and it's really difficult to stay up to date in that field because there's so many publications coming out. But even then, we do have a lot of questions still, and even on anatomy, that's still maybe surprising. But even on the level of anatomy, we do have some questions. Well, in general, so the ACL is a structure, an intra-articular structure within the knee joint. Approximately attaching from the posteromedial edge of the lateral femoral bundle, and then it follows like a oblique course into the anterior medial distal direction, and then attaches distally on the tibial plateau.
Okay.
So that's a little bit the basic anatomy. Most researchers think the ACL consists of two bundles. We have an anterior medial bundle and a posterolateral bundle. Okay, that's what most of the authors think. Some of them argue also that there would be three bundles, an intermediate bundle as well. But the most commonly
agreed upon
thing to talk about is then that there are two bundles. And from a mechanical perspective, the ACL is a primary restraint to anterior tibial translation, but also a secondary mechanical restraint to internal tibial rotation. So we have a mechanical function, which is very important in the knee joint there. But important to know is next to this mechanical function, we also know that the ACL has an important sensory function. This has been discovered already a lot of years ago, but again, this is more and more going into depth within research now, what it really means. So we know already from 30, 40, even longer years ago that there are, especially at the insertions of the ACL, there are really neurosensory areas with high concentrations of different kind of mechanoreceptors. So receptors which are providing the central nervous system with information on, for example, the knee position, on the movements, etc. So they can give the central nervous system proprioceptive information. Yeah?
Okay.
And this efferent feedback has an important role in regulating muscle activity around the knee joint, but even we know now from more recent studies that this sensory input can even travel along towards the brain. So we have a connection. It's not only a mechanical issue over there with ACL injuries. We know also that there are also the neurosensory system can also play a role, and that's important to know and important to be able to understand how, for example, a patient might develop the feeling of instability, for example. Yeah?
Okay.
So it's not only mechanical. We see even when a patient has had the operation, still the knee can feel subjectively more unstable. So even when the mechanical restraints are normal again, we even see then some feelings of instability. That's possible. It's perfectly possible.
That's something that we will circle back to. Quite interesting to try and unpack that. But how is it that these sorts of injuries can occur? How you do a lot of sports physio yourself. Obviously, ACL is bread and butter of what you do. What are the most frequent injuries for this population?
Yeah. So it's also important to know, indeed, to know if we know how the injury happens, we probably know better, or that's at least a starting point, to think about how we could prevent them. That's an important point there.
Yeah.
So classically, we see that these injuries mainly occur in athletes performing in multidirectional sports. Think about basketball, soccer, etc., handball, these kind of sports. And classically, we see that in research, there's a distinction between contact and non-contact injuries. Even though this classification into two groups is probably a little bit too simplistic. Because on one hand, okay, the contact injuries, where there is really a direct contact on the knee joint. For example, you play soccer and you have a player tackling on your knee, on the lateral aspect of your knee, and your knee collapses into valgus. Well, that's a direct contact injury. Or, for example, you do sliding and another player falls on your knee and you have an ACL injury. Yeah, that's something that we call a direct contact injury, contact mechanism.
Uh-huh.
But on the other hand, we see that if we look at the so-called non-contact injuries, a large proportion of these patients are not purely non-contact. What I mean is there that a lot of them, I would think around 50% of those who are classically called non-contact, they have actually an indirect contact during just before they have the ACL injury. This means that, for example, they make a jump, for example, a soccer player who wants to do a heading, and then suddenly he got a push, for example, on his shoulders, yeah, and then he lands, okay? And then he turns his ACL. So there is no direct contact when he has the ACL injury itself, but his movement was perturbed, or he was suddenly in a non-expected situation, based on, for example, a contact with another player.
Okay.
That's what we certainly often see. They make a jump, they had a collision with another player, and then they land on the ground, and then they have an ACL injury. That's what we call a indirect non-contact injury. Yeah? So it's classically called non-contact because they have no contact when they tear their ACL, but actually there's indirect contact,
Yeah.
when they have the ACL injury. And the third group is then will the classic non-contact. So there's no other players involved around the player there who gets the ACL injury. They make, for example, they run and they want to make a cutting maneuver, and then they suddenly tear the ACL. That's what we also call a classic non-contact. But even there, it's interesting to see if you would go to YouTube, for example, and you would type ACL injuries, non-contact ACL injuries. You also, if you look at a lot of videos there, and as also mentioned in literature, of course, you see that in a lot of cases, there is a very quick decision-making process just before they make a certain movement. For example, they run towards another player, and then they want to make a cut into the right or the left. But often they make this decision to go to the left or right based on the movement of the other player, So it's often reacting on something, even though there is no physical contact. What we see is that we consider that as a cognitive contact. They're moving in an environment where they have to take into account other players, the movement of the ball, etc.
Yeah.
So that's very interesting to observe.
Huh. Yeah, that's absolutely. It's funny. There's a player at a football club, amateur club I used to physio with, that mentioned that when he has torn it, it's been in those situations where he's had to suddenly make a snap decision because of somebody else, and all of a sudden, I think twice. Yeah, so he's now on his potentially fourth surgery. And two of those times were because of this.
And I think it's something.
Before I met him. So,
yeah. I think that's something we miss often when we look at ACL injuries. We often look at this from a purely biomechanical point of view, and we want to describe, okay, the foot is far away from the center of mass, the knee is moving into valgus, etc. The trungus more upright or more in the direction of the stance limb, etc. That's a biomechanical description of these ACL injuries. But we know that other factors can be involved as well. And so especially the very quick decision making is a very important point to know, because this has clear implications towards the rehabilitation and prevention. So this is really, we have to train. So maybe we can come back later to that. But if we're going to teach people to move in a certain way, or to be very conscious with their movements, to say, okay, you should not be allowed to move your knee over your toe, etc., 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 with really internally focused instructions. Well, probably what we know is that during performing your sport, you don't have any time to think about your movements, or you are too late, or you are moving non-efficiently. So this is really very important to integrate these aspects and to think about what we're really aiming to do during the rehab. Do we really want to restrict movements and to make them very conscious about their movements? Probably not. Because the transfer towards these very quick decision-making processes is not directly there. But we can discuss maybe that later once we go further into the rehab process.
Absolutely. So obviously you've gone over briefly the anatomy. What are the different types of surgery that you might sort of come across, or the different grafts or the additional aspects that come into it? So someone who's taken a slide tackle that's gone bad, or someone that's just done it in one of these sprinting and quick turn motions, change directions. What sort of what are the different surgeries or something that someone may come across?
Yeah, so there are indeed different types of surgery that can be applied. Maybe the first question is, should they have a surgery? That's another topic of interest these days. Yeah. But if there is a surgery, indeed, there are different factors to take into account. first thing is, okay, are we dealing with a primary or a secondary, or as you just mentioned, maybe a third or a fourth ACL reconstruction?
Yeah.
That will definitely also define which graft can be used or will be used. So another thing is, are there other injuries, such as meniscus injuries, such as mainly, for example, posterolateral corner injuries, meniscus injuries, so as I just mentioned, collateral ligaments, medial lateral ligaments, etc. So especially those injuries who have an important meaning towards rotational control of the knee are very important, not to be missed during the initial diagnosis of the knee. So if we know that if we, for example, operate an ACL injured patient, and we don't pay attention to, for example, a posterolateral deficiency, rotational control deficiency, well, the risk to get a new injury or have a failing of your ACL repair will probably, or reconstruction, sorry, will be higher. So that's something that a surgeon has an important role, not to miss the other injuries, and to take care of that as well. But another thing that plays a very important role are the preferences of and the experience of the surgeon. So if we will maybe just go now into detail more on different types of grafts that can be used. And classically, we have the biggest group of autografts, meaning we take a graft of the person itself. So and that's often then dependent on the country also where you work in, can be different. In Belgium, for example, also in Netherlands, I think it's mostly the hamstring that's been taken. I don't know how in your practice was your experience there, Sunny? Also patella tendon that you see often?
Yeah, generally speaking, I think people who it's their first surgery, they'll go with hamstring, and if it's a revision surgery, then potentially the patella tendon.
Yeah,
for the bone plugs on both sides.
That's how it's mostly what we mostly see in surgeries these days. But however, I think it's important to know what I just mentioned. There's also if you have, for example, a surgeon who has all his life doing, for example, patella tendon grafts, well, probably he's more familiar and more experienced in doing these grafts. And the other way around, if he's only doing hamstring grafts, probably he gets more experience in doing that, and maybe not so experienced in doing patella tendon. So that's also something to take into account: experience and the preference of the surgeon. However, it's also interesting to see that different grafts are associated with different problems or advantages and disadvantages. So the comparison between grafts is often made in literature based on checking, okay, do we have more re-injuries in one or the other graft? There's still some discussion around that. There are studies showing that you have even more re-injuries with a hamstring autograft, but also studies showing the opposite. So that's not really so very strongly conclusive there. However, there are directions that even patella tendon grafts have less re-injuries. However, then we come to another point, is that when you only look at graft re-injury, that's probably not enough to say the one graft is better than the other, because you can also have other problems which are not related to re-injury.
Yeah.
For example, if we look at patella tendon bone grafts, we see that anecdotally we see some anterior knee pain, which can be more prevalent. Quadriceps weakness, patella tendon problems. While in the hamstring autograft, we see logically that again here the weakness of the muscles is the greatest where we take the tendon, in this case the hamstrings. So in hamstring grafts, we see more weakness in the hamstrings. When we take a patellar tendon or a quadriceps tendon, we typically see more weakness in the quadriceps. Okay, but another point from the hamstring grafts is also that we lose an important synergist of the ACL, an important restraint on the medial posteromedial aspect of the knee joints. And we know that especially the semitendinosus is an important muscle there. So that's also something into account. Sometimes we also see, based on the operation, we see some numbness of the chin, based on the incision where we where the surgeon makes a tunnel, and some that can be related to damage of the saphenous nerve, but that's something that will mostly recover over time. It can take some time, some months, but that will mostly have a good evolution and not the biggest problem for the patients. Mostly. So these are, indeed pros and contrasts for different surgeries, but mostly we aim to go for a autograft. And so hamstrings and quadriceps, patella tendons are the most commonly used. The quadriceps tendon is less used unless there are indeed secondary or tertiary ACL constructions. Allografts are not the primary choice of especially not for a first ACL construction. We know that autografts appear to be superior to allografts. Allografts mean that we take a tendon from another person, for example, a tibialis posterior tendon, for example. The thing is that the re-injury rate is higher, the failure rate is higher, and also the cost effectiveness, because harvesting or taking or buying a tendon costs money, and it's in terms of cost effectiveness maybe also not the best way to choose in young athletes.
Okay.
And the third option is then to take synthetic grafts. This is also something more in development. We see there a lot of evolution in these things, but we don't have yet the long-term outcomes there, and not yet the best solution. So that's often also not the primary choice to go for a synthetic graft currently. Maybe in the future we make there more developments, and as such we can maybe avoid that we have to take a graft, and we have the morbidities there. But I don't think we are there yet to come up with a very good option there yet on this moment, if we look at long-term results.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what do you think, as you've been a physio for a while now, what do you think have been the biggest developments specifically with regards to ACL rehab then? What do you think in this time has made the biggest difference to someone's rehabilitation for prevention of re-injury?
Oh, well, I think different factors can play a role. So you have basically, you can divide this in two different aspects, which are, of course, the operation itself. If there is operation, if you talk now about just rehabilitation after ACL reconstruction, well, there are two factors: the operation itself, based on the surgical experience, expertise, and the technical performance of the surgery is important there, and also not to miss other injuries. But at least as important is, and I would say even more important, even though they go together, of course, is the rehabilitation itself. And there, well, we have, again, two factors which can play a role, which is the patient itself. And the second thing is our external factors, and the therapist is an external factor, which is very important. So if we look at the patient, what does play a role in having a good or less optimal outcome? Demographics. We know that young, active male athletes, for example, have a higher chance to get back to sports. We also know that the level of play can play a role. So higher level athletes have a better chance to return to sport. Motivation, very important. So if you have a player who is really motivated and really keen to return to sport and do everything which is needed in the rehab, this is very important. And we know that the outcomes will be better. and also people, really the attitude of the patient itself, the understanding of the course of the rehab, which can create realistic expectations. These things are also important to know that these factors can affect the outcome on the long term when we look at the patient itself. Okay.
Yeah.
And the other factors, then the external factors, which I would say the therapist, the physical therapist plays an essential role. And I don't say this because I'm a physical therapist. We know that. We know that because he is the key person to motivate the patient, to provide feedback, to set goals, to empower the athlete, and essentially to provide high value care. And that is really the key to its success, that rehab should be up to date, and rehab should contain a few factors that maybe we can discuss that also later, which factors are very essential there. Mm-hmm. But we typically see that the rehab is just not what it should be. And we know that from a few survey studies, but I also see that typically in my studies and in my clinical practice, people who get from somewhere else, typically they don't get good rehab, and that's a big problem. It's a bit like translation, research to practice, etc. That's a big gap, I think.
That was going to be sort of my next question, segueing into how do you feel that your research, the research you carry out, has impacted you as a physio for this patient population? How do you feel it's guided your development for somebody else's rehabilitation development?
Yeah, I think what we try to do is come up with new things, okay, and new ideas. And again, as I mentioned earlier in the conversation here, you as a researcher, you don't have to think that you can change everything of ACL. That would be very illogical reasoning, but we have to try to move forward. And we have different problems, high re-injury rates. We have a lot of patients who don't get back to sport, etc. So we have to try to be better. So to come back to your question, what are the main things that have affected the outcomes of my patients or the approach to my patients based on my research? I think it's mainly also a better insight in the sensory motor system. So what really happens, and acknowledging that it's not just mechanical dysfunction, what we have there as ACL injury. And also, just because you learn so much, go into detail on all the aspects, meaning into the biomechanics, into the psychology of an injury. But if I didn't do research on psychological factors, but we know that these factors can play a very important role in the recovery of these patients. Mm-hmm. So that's something we have to take into account. But basically, if the question is, okay, which are the most important factors that influenced my clinical practice, it's probably insights in the sensory motor system, and in association with that, the models or the possibilities to learn people moving or getting better or progressing within the different stages of the rehab process. How we apply motor learning principles associated with sensory motor aspects there. That's maybe the biggest evolution of the last couple of years that we have in this field.
Okay, so would you say that's more so, you mentioned earlier about the biomechanical and the intrinsic instructions. Would you say that's utilizing the sensory motor side with extrinsic movement patterns? Would you say that's a fair way?
Yeah. So before we go into detail on how we instruct patients to move, maybe we should first say something about what's really going on in that sensory motor system before we can understand what we should not do or maybe we can do better. Mm-hmm. So as I discussed, there are sensory endings in the ACL.
Yeah.
And when we have a ACL injury, we know that the sensory input towards the central nervous system will be different. Yeah? And that is a big challenge for the central nervous system, because suddenly they have other information, also because of pain, because of effusion in the knee, but also based on the altered afferent inputs from the knee. Well, the central nervous system has to deal with this. But what we typically see, and these are really exciting discoveries during the last couple of years, even with neuroimaging studies, when we look at fMRI studies, for example, we see that patients after an ACL injury, they tend to activate certain regions which are dealing with, for example, more visual attention of movements, from visual regions of brain activity that we see there. Also conscious movement planning. So we see that these patients have, they might need more conscious movement planning, even doing very simple movements. That's what we typically can observe in these kind of studies. And that the sensory motor integration is problematic in these kind of patients. So the input comes in there, it's altered, your system has to deal with it. This is probably relatively fine during very simple tasks, but the problem is that we see that in my studies, but also in other studies, when you take, for example, the visual system away, you ask, for example, to close their eyes, well, then they have not the possibility anymore to compensate with their visual system for the proprioceptive loss. Yeah? Mm-hmm. And then we see typically bigger problems in terms of postural control, of movement patterns, etc. When we, for example, challenge the visual system, or we bring these patients into more quick decision-making processes, which we discussed already in the injury mechanism.
Yeah.
Knowing that these findings, maybe we have to think then, how are we going to learn these patients to do exercises? So if we go back and think about what we do, typically like 90-95% of therapists, they give instructions which are very internally focused. Mm-hmm. This means that we put the attention of the instruction and we make sure the patient is really focusing on a certain body part. For example, the knee. No? Yeah. For example, flex your knee, or can also be related to muscle. Contract your quadriceps. Do a core contraction. First contract your hamstring, then your quadriceps. That's the classical way of learning patients to move or do exercises. You should not move your knee in front of your toes, etc., etc., etc. Often, and that's something funny, if you look at patients, they're always watching their knee. They're always watching and controlling the knee. They want to have everything under control. Maybe not so illogical, of course, because they had an injury and they want to, their body is a little bit different now, and they want to make sure they do everything right. But the question is, if we continue to do that, if that's really the best option to make sure the patient gets, again, adaptable towards complex situations. Mm-hmm. Like, finally, we can encounter that on the field. On the field where we have different players, the ball, etc. Very quick decision making. Yeah. So some people say, okay, that's true. That's the end phase. But in my opinion, you can already apply these principles very early on in the rehab process. Even if it's, for example, weight shifting. For example, if we talk about decision-making processing, if we do, for example, two persons in front of each other, and when one person is going on the right, you can say, okay, when he's going on his right leg, you have to go on the left leg, for example. Mm-hmm. And the exercise is actually the same. You go on your left or right leg, but the process to get there is totally different. And of course, you can make sure there that the biomechanical loading is not excessive there, and they can still relatively good control their movements. But the process to get to a movement can be totally different if you integrate these kind of aspects. Yeah? And another thing can be there, for example, if you want to learn some squatting, etc. You can say, okay, reach towards that cone instead of, for example, saying flex your trunk or whatever, flex your knee. And I think an important thing is there that maybe it's not the most important thing, the exercise itself, but maybe the variation between exercises and the stimulation constantly of the sensory motor system, which will define how well we can, from the beginning on, integrate the sensory motor system in that process. If we do only exercises which are very boring and only repetition of the same, probably we will get better with that exercise, indeed. But the question is there, do we really learn something? And learning is not the same as performing well on exercise. That's a big difference. So we want to do a lot of variations there, even if it's only very small variation. That's an important principle there that we try to apply already in the beginning.
So that's the sort of ways that you try to implement this into your own practice, then into your own rehab.
Yeah.
Of
what we try to do
is making sure you emphasize the sensory motor aspect.
Yeah, but it doesn't mean, of course, and that's also an important point, which is often missed in rehab, that we don't have to train hard or don't have to do strength training or whatever. That's not the same, totally different story. But that's not often a thing that's often missed for rehab practitioners, that we underload actually our patients far too much. And then we see indeed that patients get back to more dynamic activities, for example, running or jumping, and then they had a swollen knee, they had pain in their knee, etc. But typically, that's because we try to do tasks where we're not prepared for.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very important to give the appropriate loading and to really go into very structured strength training as well, to prepare these athletes for dynamic activities. And that's really often a problem. So they get back to running, but they don't have the capacity to do so. And then they have problems. So that's something we should take into account.
So then how would you build up to that? And what's your path to making sure that you have a patient that can do this?
So the thing is, how we work is always combining some timing aspects. We take into account the biological recovery of a knee. But we couple that with more criteria-based progressions. So we only progress towards the next phase when we observe with very easy clinical tests that a patient can go to the next phase. So, for example, if we talk about going back to running, it's always a clinical question we often get. When can an athlete go back to running? We first have to know the activity of running. What really happens there? That's the starting point. If we want to jump, we have to know what happens during jumping. If we want to go to a cutting, we have to know what happens during cutting. The same for running. Running is actually repeatedly landing on one leg. That means that if we look at for example, the ground reaction forces associated with running, if we look at the muscle forces required to run, well, these are far beyond one time your body weight.
Mm-hmm.
So in essence, only body weight exercises such as squatting, especially on two legs, because that's 50% of your body weight going to one leg.
Yeah,
it's far not enough to go towards the loading of running. So what we do we have some criteria that we developed. And for example, if we look at going back to run, well, the first stage, which is the early post-op, should be fine, of course. The second stage will be progressively loading, where we really try to increase the loading tolerance and to increase the tissue capacity should be increased. And there, if we want to go then to the next stage, towards the more dynamic phase where running is also involved, what we use in clinic is, for example, at least you should be able to walk for 15 minutes without any clear compensations, especially into knee extension, the end phase of the gait pattern. That's something we take into account.
Yeah.
And then we mainly check whether the athlete has the required capacity to run. And for example, and we try to do very easy exercise, very easy tests that can be applied by everyone in a clinical practice. For example, on a leg press, if we check, for example, the 10 RM, we want to have at least 70 to 80% of the other leg. Yeah, That's something we can easily do. Then, if we check, for example, the capacity of the calf muscles, which is often forgotten. Calf muscles are really essential when we go to running. And again, it's also dependent on the level of your athlete, of course. But what we see typically in clinical practice, if we make sure an athlete can perform at least 25, 30 heel raises, heel raises meaning you go on one leg, you go 1 second up, 1 second down, you raise your heel, and you go down, at least 25. Again, there is no really research on that, on return to run, and especially not these criteria, but that's clinically based and also based on some other papers of, for example, Lee Harrington in 2013. We also can check is the strength of the posterior chain. For example, very easy with single leg bridges, with the knee bent, with the knee extended. We also go there to at least 25 in the general, and that's quite difficult with hamstring grafts, especially when you do it with the knee extended. Meaning your knee on the box, a higher box. What we also do is, for example, showing good movement control and being able to land on one leg. So we start, if the right leg is the injured leg, well, we start from the left and we jump and land on the right leg. At least 30, 35, around that repetitions. Good single leg landings, step and holds, as we call that, with good movement quality. If we see there, for example, after 4 or 5 repetitions, landings on one leg, you cannot control it anymore, or you just say, okay, my knee is getting into pain and I cannot go into deep flexion there. Well, it's a no-go for running. That's something we use there. That's basically the thing. So heel raises, bridgings, step and holds. You can also check at balance tests, star excursion balance test, for example, checking the difference left and right. We want to have already an appropriate movement control and go to at least 10% difference and not more than 10%. But the main thing is actually the unloading of the quadriceps, and then the lack of muscle force in your leg, and then you get into problems when you start running, and that's a big thing. So it's really important to go into structured strength training. Another helpful thing to take into account there is what we use is doing single leg squats with a bar on your shoulders with at least 50% of your body weight in addition. And some people are surprised then because it's quite heavy. You can go into split squat. You can what else? Really put your weight really on the front leg with at least 50% above your body weight on your neck, and doing there again your single leg squattings. So that's not something that comes suddenly over there. That's something you can build up in that second phase, And the second phase starts actually after the early rehab phase, where we mainly focus on the consequences of the ACL injury. Are solved, like full knee extension, the knee swelling is went down, the pain is okay with your simple weight shifting exercise, etc. And you can go to a normal gait pattern without crutches. That's what we aim there. But then the second phase is really focusing on developing the tissue capacity to go there, and that's where typically most therapists fail, by not loading heavy enough.
Okay. And while we're still talking about your style of rehab, obviously in researching yourself and things that you've done, one of the things I came across is you've done a lot of research utilizing video analysis. Is that something that you tend to combine into your rehab process as well for, let's say, for athletes that want to return to sport? Would you say you'd utilize video analysis for something like that?
Yeah, indeed. I've indeed published some studies using 2D analysis, also 3D analysis. But of course, three-dimensional analysis is not really in most clinical practices. Let's say 99% of clinical practice, there's no 3D analysis system in there. So we have to come up with some other solutions to be able to measure some movements in clinical field or clinical practice. So indeed, I have done some work on vertical jumps, 2 legs, single leg, duck jumps. So where an athlete lifts the knees with 90 degrees there, jump. Single leg squats, running as well. So we have different functional tests, as we can say, that we could use. What we found there is that there's quite a good relationship between what we see in 2D analysis and what we see in 3D analysis, especially, of course, in the sagittal plane and also in the frontal plane. Not, of course, not in the transversal plane, because we cannot capture that. So that's a limitation, of course. But the main movement patterns can be captured quite well, especially these days when we all have a smartphone or iPad in clinical practice, which have very good and very fast cameras in there. So if we go to very fast movements, such as jumping, we aim to have a camera with around, and for example, iPad has some cameras with a sample frequency of 120 hertz, meaning that you can have a lot of images each second, and to not have a blurring of your movement. To also capture everything what happens there. But the reason why I would advise to do that is because when taking these videos, you can capture more than you can capture with your eye, especially when you go to more fast jumpings. But also when we go to asymmetries in terms of loading, often we see an unloading of the injured limb. That, for example, when we land from a jump, the injured limb is touching the ground later. So the other leg is also always the preferred leg to land first. And it's also very interesting to give feedback to your patient. So that's also something which we can use there. But of course, it also has some limitations. As I said, the transversal plane is difficult to capture, of course. But also, typically we do these kind of activities during what we call closed tasks, meaning you do a jump, you know already what you're going to do before. Sometimes the patient knows already what they have to do because the previous instructions. So it's sometimes it can also have limitations, and it's not because someone can land consciously very well that they can also translate this to unconscious movement patterns. That's something to take into account and something we have to train for as well.
You mentioned the unconscious movement patterns, and we touched on earlier about the biomechanical aspects, the intrinsic and sensory motor aspects as well. But research shows that sometimes it can take up to 2 years before that knee, that ACL is sending the same signals as it did prior to injury. Obviously, you've mentioned from your research, this is something that you are addressing in your rehab process and what you do. What tips can you give to other physios listening, to maybe even patients that are listening, to help them to sort of speed up that timeline? Obviously, you've got the neuromuscular control, the ligamentous, the sensory aspects of that affected knee.
I know there. When you talk about the 2 years, I would probably refer then to the paper of Chris Nagelli and Timothy Hewitt, referring to the fact that actually when we look at patients and we look at all the studies that exist, and we look at dynamic task, we look at proprioception, and we look at all these different aspects of the sensory-motor system, we see typically that there are indeed a lot of deficits in these patients, even when they have returned to sport, especially within these 2 years framework. And that's important to know. However, there's a very important thing to say about that, and that's the fact that we, in general, we don't really know what these patients did during the rehab process. Yeah, so that's the problem. If we look at review studies, we put all studies together, but when you go into detail on these studies, how it often goes is that we, for example, we have a surgery clinic somewhere in the world, and all the patients go to different places for rehab, and then they come back maybe at 6 or 12 months or later in the rehab process, and then they do some measurements. But the rehab is mostly not controlled, and so we have also patients there within these studies where we don't have any idea what they did, and as you see that, and what we typically encounter in clinical practice, also patients who have had very poor rehab, or maybe not even rehab, can be included in these kind of studies. So that's something to take into account. Nevertheless, we should not neglect these things, of course. This is very valuable information. And something we have to take into account that when you, for example, look at the sensory inroads in the ACL, that's probably not going to happen. Not in the same way as the ACL was before.
Yeah.
So this is important to know. But this means that we have to develop other strategies to cope with this.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what I already referred to. This goes far further than the knee joint itself. So we have to develop what we call then neuroplasticity, and to train also the brain to come up with adaptive strategies to deal with this process.
Okay.
And in my perspective, if we start only at, for example, 8 months with this kind of exercises, it's, of course, then you have only a few sessions to deal with this.
Yeah.
But we know that when we can already integrate this very early on, well, the chance to really change something in your sensory system and neurosensory pathways will probably be higher. We don't have the hard evidence to say so, but from a logical neurophysiological perspective, you could argue, you can say this, and saying that the more you train into these variations on different patterns, including these aspects, well, you could argue that the chance to develop better patterns would increase. Yeah.
Okay. Nice.
But we don't really know yet. We don't have hard evidence for that. And indeed, currently, we see that patients are really not doing well within the 2 years and even after, even when they are released to return to sport by their physical therapist. And that's what I already mentioned. Most therapists just fail by doing the appropriate rehab and applying the appropriate criteria to return to sports in a safe way. And that's maybe hard to hear. don't say everyone is doing a bad job. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. But and if we look in general, the content of rehab is often not good enough. In general, if we would put all physical therapists together and we look at the content there, then that's also reflected by the results. If we see that patients who have returned to sports, only 23% of those who have returned to sports pass very basic tests such as a single leg hop test with a criteria of 90%, then the conclusion could be, well, they didn't have really appropriate step-by-step criterion-based rehab, because otherwise they wouldn't have returned to that phase. Yeah, or it could also be that maybe, and that's an important point, also in some countries, we don't have the possibilities to follow up a patient during a long period. And in some countries, we only have the possibility to see a patient a few times, even after ACL injury. But then we come back to the healthcare system, and the question is there, do we have a good healthcare system to come up with a good solution for these patients? That's an important question as well. Huh? So if we only have a few limited times that we can see these patients, and then they're left in on the sports field, and they have to make their decision by themselves, maybe it's not surprising that the outcomes are not that good as well.
The re-injury rates.
That's an important question as well.
Okay. So sticking with sort of return to play, getting back on the field and whatnot, generally speaking, you're looking at 9 to 12 months, right? For most people, if they've had a good rehab process, if everything's going well, you're looking at about 9 to 12 months. What about someone like Zlatan Ibrahimovic, who got back to top flight competition, not just kicking a ball about, but to the top of the top within 6 to 7 months, I think. Yeah, he's an elite level athlete. He has access to more facilities, but the body can only move so quick itself as well. There's only so much the body can do in a space of time. What would you say was a main factor in his rehab to get him back so quick?
Well, first of all, I think it's always a little bit dangerous to compare a patient with another person. But the example of Zlatan is indeed really good to discuss, because at the same time as he was doing his rehab, I had patients in my clinic who say, okay, I'm going to do like Zlatan. I'm going to also stick this criteria within a few months, and I'm going back to play. And that's often dangerous, as I said, because also patients going to mirror them to, even if they're not Zlatan, of course, but they're going to mirror themselves towards other players and examples. Also in the media, like a spectacular return to sport within 4, 5, 6 months, sometimes even. That's really crazy, of course, but these things happen. But there are clear differences. First of all, of course, the level of play and the level of rehab, and the time to be able to devote your time towards rehab. Typically, you have the typical patient will have to work during the day and will come, for example, late in the evening, they come to do rehab. When you are a professional athlete, they can do rehab for 6 hours a day, and then, of course, they will develop in a faster way their physical capacity.
Yeah,
that's a different thing. On the other hand, we also have numerous examples of top-level players who aim to return very fast to sport, but got re-injured. And so, generally speaking, I don't say it's impossible. It's also dependent on the timing of the season, for example. For example, let's say if you have a World Cup within 6 months ahead, and you are at the end of your career and it's your final chance to get to the World Cup, that's a total different story than a young player who has the whole career in front of him and has no big tournament or no big time pressure in there. so that's also contextual factors who can also play a role.
Mm-hmm.
But in general speaking, if you look at the data that we have now, it's indeed far too early to return, both from a biological perspective, the ligamentization of the ligament itself, also from a cartilage perspective, but especially from athletes that we typically encounter in clinical practice, to regain all aspects that are needed to come back to sports within that framework. Yeah? So typically, some therapists argue then, okay, but my athlete is ready. Huh? But when you really question them or would test that patient then and look at all the factors that are needed, including on-field rehab, etc., including power development, including strength at all these aspects, typically you still find deficits. But the thing is, of course, if you don't test it, you will not see it or mention it. So my point is, in general, indeed, we have a biological time framework, which we think needs at least 9 months. And then we have the time to develop your physical abilities again, which will, for most athletes, take absolutely more than 9 to 6 months to come back to develop all these aspects again.
Okay.
So again, I don't say it's impossible, but it's for 90% of the athletes, we don't have to mirror someone towards another athlete. And furthermore, coming back to the example of Zlatan, he was also not performing very. He came back in the first game he scored, I remember.
Yeah.
But then he had a setback as well after that. So, okay, that's again one example, but doesn't matter so much. But to really come back to performance, it's another aspect than being back on the pitch and just being there, you know. And athlete feels also that by himself. Often when you talk about it with patients, they also mention it, you know, it doesn't feel the same yet. You know, they need some time to be on the pitch, do on-field retraining, and to be back in the team again.
What would you say is sort of next for you then? What's next for Bart Dingenen?
Well, first of all, I don't think it's only about Bart Dingenen. It's just all that matters are the patients, you know, and the scientific field, of course, to move forward. But what's next? Maybe the biggest thing to improve the outcomes of the patients currently is just to improve the rehab and to bridge the gap between research and practice. Mm-hmm. Because if we even don't do the basics very well, and I mean then strength and performing, for example, also jump retraining, on-field retraining, also preoperative training. We didn't discuss that yet, but it's also essentially to go into rehab even before your surgery. Yeah, to have a knee which is as good as possible before you go into surgery. The outcomes are better than after surgery.
Yeah.
Well, I think the biggest point to make really improvements worldwide are things to translate research to practice and just get the rehab out there and learn people how to improve their rehab. And we don't have the perfect rehab program, something. It can also be highly individual. But I'm just saying that if we observe now in studies and also what I see daily in clinical practice with other athletes who come from somewhere else, if we see what's going on in clinical practices, often this is often not good enough, and we have a big step to make there. And I would say first do the basics very well, and don't do very spectacular things. Your Instagram account, movies, etc. before the basics are really there. You know, just do your basics very well, and then move on to other things. And don't go 5 steps further before you have done the basics very well.
Okay.
Good. That's one thing. Of course, in the scientific field, we have to make a lot of progressions. I think across the whole continuum of rehab. For example, defining who is suitable for non-operative or operative treatment. That's something we have to develop better guidelines for. Also, develop maybe more strict criteria that we can use across the whole rehab phase. Yeah? As I just mentioned, one example, we'll go back to running. But we have to develop across that whole phase better criteria. And what we also think now is that each individual needs the same criteria, but that's also not the case, of course. If you have a low-profile athlete, you just want to go for a run 2 times in a week, or we have a high elite basketball player, of course, the requirements will be different.
Mm-hmm.
And essentially, when you have a patient, that's where you start with. Which are the requirements of my patient?
Yeah.
Where do I start? Where do I want to go? Which are the requirements? And then you go back and thinking, okay, what do I need for that? Think about soccer, think about basketball. It's a highly intermittent aerobic and anaerobic capacity. We need that to perform well. Not only about strength and etc. We also need these capacities to think about what I'm going to do during my rehab process. Yeah?
Well, look, Bart, I think we'll wrap it up there. With this topic, there's so much we have to explore, so many areas you and I haven't even touched on yet. As you mentioned earlier in the podcast, something like whether surgery is even an option that's needed, and the whats and the whys around that. But we can save that for a future edition. To sign off with, why don't you let anyone listening know how they can get in touch with you, your social media, or any future events that you're participating in?
Yeah, sure. Thank you also for the invitation. Again, I think it's very important. And a lot of people, when I go abroad in other countries or when I give presentations anywhere around the world, it's always get a lot of questions on, okay, how do you do that? Or for example, when are you going to write a book on all the things you say? That's often the question I get. But again, this reflects that we need more translation to the practice. And I think this kind of podcast is very a good beginning, let's say, to translate some findings already. And again, I don't say that we know everything. Absolutely not. I mentioned that a few times. We have a lot of questions still, but I'm pretty sure that we can do better than what we do currently in clinical practice. And to your question about following on social media, well, my professional profile, let's say, is more on Twitter. On Twitter, you can follow me by just @Bart Dingenen. Just my name, actually. You can follow me there on Twitter. Or on Instagram is also possible, or maybe just send me a mail. Maybe we can add you the contact details later on the podcast also. And then indeed, I'm also teaching in Belgium, Netherlands, also often this year and next year also in France. So next week I'm heading to India to teach courses on ACL. So also, if there are questions here for workshops or whatever, you can contact me, of course. Also, that's something I also love to do to help people improving their outcomes of their patients.
Thank you again, and we'll speak soon.
Okay, it's a pleasure.
Well, ladies and gents, thanks again for listening in, and we'll catch you next time. As always, wherever you're listening to this, we appreciate your time, and if you have any comments or suggestions, feel free to get in contact and let us know. Until next time.